Okay, I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing our second keynote speaker, Derek Sayer. Derek is Professor of Cultural History at the University of Lancaster and Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta in Canada. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's had a very interesting academic path. He started off in classical sociology, publishing books such as The Violence of Abstraction, 1986, or Capitalism and Modernity, an excursus on Marx and Weber, 1990. More recently, he's been interested in Czech history and using that as a platform to explore the idea of modernity, branching out into art, literature, very many different fields. For example, he published The Coast of Bohemia in 1998, I believe, and his most recent book, Prague, Capital of the 20th Century, A Surrealist History, was awarded, amongst other distinctions, the George L. Moss Prize of the American Historical Association. His memory is one of his many interests. For example, in 2013, he co-edited a book called The Inhabited Ruins of Central Europe, which is, amongst other things, about memory discourses in this region. He is also an outspoken and celebrated critic of the UK Research Excellence Framework, and one of his books is called Rank Hypocrisies, the Insult of the RAF. So as a robust defender of academic freedom against an overly meddling state, he represents, I believe, all of our interests. So we have a truly multidisciplinary scholar reflecting the nature of memory studies itself. And his talk is entitled Memory Regions, Texas, Berlin. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. As it happens, this will be my last official academic engagement since, reasons not unrelated to my dislike of the REF, I shall be retiring from Lancaster University at the end of this month to live the free and easy life of a scholar back in Canada. Now, by saying that, I'm saying that I've attended many, many gatherings of this kind over the last 35 or 40 years, or however long it is. And one thing I can't help noticing is that they invariably start out, whatever the disciplinary mix, and whatever the ostensive topic of discussion, rather as we did this morning, which was, how do we get the concepts right? If we can just pin down the right concepts, define the right unit of analysis, our problems are going to be solved. Somewhere down the line, I ceased to believe that. Rather than thinking that the way to deal with vague concepts, somebody said this morning, I think, very fruitfully, that what he liked about the concept of regions of memory was its imprecision. Rather than dealing with vague concepts by making them more precise, I would rather go along with the film director Jean-Luc Godard, who insisted that it is necessary to confront vague ideas with clear images. And there's some clear images rather than clear concepts that I have to offer today. Specifically, I'm looking at the way that events in East Central Europe have been, as it were, remembered in East Central Texas. And it is indeed a highly imaginative constellation or articulation. And I warn you in advance that the devil is in the detail. So without further ado, let's move on. On the College Station campus of Texas A&M University, in the courtyard of the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, stands what must be one of the strangest monuments in the world. There's a picture of it here. A plaque on the plinth informs us that Vera Goodnight's sculpture commemorates, quote, the sudden and unexpected collapse of the Berlin Wall on 9 November 1989, a moment of joy felt around the world when Berlin was reunited. Well, we did hear this morning that Wikipedia has entries in 104 different languages for the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's clearly a global event that registered in different ways in all sorts of people's memories. But in this case, the registering is very local and particular indeed. The sculpture is 30 feet long, 18 feet wide, and 12 feet high. It weighs 7 tons, and it's made up of 5 horses, 1 stallion, and 4 mares, running through the rubble of the collapsed Berlin Wall. Now, the sculpture incorporates graffiti, which is copied from the western side of the wall. And according to the plaque, at President Bush's request, the names of 15 people killed at the Berlin Wall are written on the Dove of Peace. These names represent over 900 people who were killed trying to escape to the west. Now, the gender of the animals, the artist's website informs us, was not incidental. The wall, quote, had separated families and loved ones for over 28 years. Burrell represents this separation by placing the stallion, symbolic of man, entirely within what would have been East Berlin. The mares, symbolic of family, are passing the death strip and entering the West to a new life of freedom. Now, Vera Goodnight is known and much loved in and around Texas for her traditional realism style. But here, realism, sorry, this thing is going too fast. Oh, no, it's okay. But here, realism clearly serves as a vehicle for transmuting the imaginary into the symbolic. The day the wall came down, the website continues, is not about horses. It is about freedom. One's encouraged to say, no shit. Now, the sculpture was lent to the state of Georgia, and it was first unveiled at the 1996 Atlanta Olympic Games, before it was moved to its present location, where it was officially dedicated on 11th of October 1997. What home, we might ask, could be more fitting for such a monument than the George H.W. Bush Presidential Museum? Goodnight's Liberty horses take pride of place in a collection documenting the elder Bush's term in office that was described in 2010 as including more than 100,000 artifacts, ranging from a White House doghouse for Millie to solid gold palm trees to the Kuwaiti door located in our Gulf War exhibit. President Bush's diplomatic skills, the plaque goes on, enabled the hole in the Berlin Wall to become so large that all of Eastern Europe was set free from communist rule. The Cold War was ended. Now, the East Germans, Czechs and Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, Bulgarians and Romanians, whose revolutions toppled their communist governments in the weeks after the wall fell, might very well remember their history somewhat differently. But in Texas, I remind myself, they call it walking. Now, a second casting of the monument, and again, remember the size of this thing, was gifted by the United States government to the people of Germany, flown in by US Air Force C-17 cargo plane on the 50th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, and dedicated at the Allied Museum in Berlin by former President Bush, as he had then become, in July 1998. That is to say, during Bill Clinton's second term in office. Vera Goodnight, the sculptor, and her husband were thrilled to accompany the sculpture on the plane for the ceremony. A According to the opening address on its website in 2010, the Allied Museum, where the second copy of the monument is housed, tells a unique story full of excitement and drama. Almost like in a fairy tale, the forces of good win in the end. Now, to avoid any confusion as to which forces of good are being referred to here, the website makes it clear that since the Soviet blockade in 1948-49, the Berliners meant the Western forces when they spoke of the circle of war, when they spoke of the Allies. The Soviet Union had withdrawn from the circle of war allies. It was, of course, the Soviet Red Army, not the Western forces, that liberated Berlin and ended the war in Europe on 8th of May 1945, but no matter. Memory is infinitely mutable. Sorry. In October 2000, Vera Goodnight was awarded the CIA Agency Seal Medallion, inscribed with the words, "For your vision of freedom, patriotism, and expression of the human spirit." The agency seal is reserved for non-agency personnel, to include US government employees and private citizens who have made significant contributions to the agency's intelligence efforts. Just think about what's involved in seeing the production of this sculpture as a significant contribution to the CIA's efforts. Now, the CIA later purchased one of the maquettes for the day the wall came down for its offices in Washington, D.C., which is now displayed in the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Another maquette, sorry. No, I don't have the other one here. Another maquette adorns the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley in California. Was it not President Reagan, after all, who stood at the Brandenburg Gate on 12th of June 1987, the same spot where President John F. Kennedy had proclaimed "Ich bin eine Berliner" 24 years earlier and demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now let me move on from the monument to the sculptor. The choice of Vera Goodnight for such a commission was in some ways a very surprising one, since the artist was known not as a designer of grandiose monuments, but in her own words, as a sculptor of Western women and animals. It was also in its way a stroke of pure genius, because The Day the Wall Came Down manages to conjoin the most irreconcilable of realities on the most inappropriate of planes, and yet makes their conjunction appear the most natural thing in the world. One West comes to effortlessly stand in for another, binding the two in powerful signifying chains of affect. I was born loving animals and the American West. This has been the focus of my art for over 3 decades, Verrill tells us. Working from life was initially an excuse to be outdoors and near the horses, birds, and many other animals that shared my life. She declined a scholarship to study art at the University of Colorado in Boulder because she had no interest in abstract art, preferring instead to attend business school and use her spare time to learn from the individual artists that she most admired. Now, Goodnight's work soon found an affectionate place in both public and corporate collections of art, although not, it has to be said, in the nation's great art museums. Clement Greenberg would likely have dismissed her longhorns and elk, burros and bison, wolves and coyotes, cowgirls and Indians as the epitome of kitsch. Ersatz culture, a formulaic compound of vicarious experience and fake sensations, destined for those who are insensible to the values of genuine culture, are hungry nevertheless for the diversion that only culture of some sort can provide. Certainly this is not an art that could be described as difficult. There's nothing in Goodnight's work to challenge either the eye or the brain. So let me just flip back a little here. Right. In Team Ropers, a boy playing with a border collie graces the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame at Colorado Springs, and the second copy can be found in the Houston Astrodome. American Warrior, which you see here, a Cheyenne chief, rides tall at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington. All sorts of ironies there. Paint Mare and Filly, a life-size horse and colt, greets visitors to the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Goodnight feels a particular affinity, she says, with the women of the West, seeking to portray their courage, determination, and fulfillment in ways that allow them to seem so capable and yet remain feminine. In passing times, two women riders, one sitting side saddle and one astride the horse. This sculpture adorns the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame at Fort Worth in Texas. Now, this is not Vera Goodnight's only foray into equine metaphor. Set in 1910, Ready to Ride portrays, quote, a confident young woman in a split skirt, ready to do anything. One of the biggest controversies in Washington during the real push for women's voting was by riding in a split skirt, explains the artist. No Turning Back depicts a pioneer woman standing proud and upright beside a wagon wheel in the Frontier Days Old West Museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Too young and naive to think they could fail, too full of visions for the end of the trail, they stored their silk dresses and donned calico to join in the cry of Westward Ho, begins the poem, which is one of Goodnight's own. Another fun sculpture, according to the magazine Western Art Collector, is titled Daydreaming. Here, a teenage girl is standing next to a dairy cow she should be bringing in from the field, but her faraway look, with her arm draped over the cow's back and rope hand on her hip, clearly convey that she has other things on her young mind. As I said, the devil is in the detail. Now, we're a very long way from Berlin, though quite where is uncertain. Goodnight's sculptures may be as down-home as Texas peach pie, but her world hovers on uneasy borderlines between past and present, waking and dreams. Her husband Roger is a pilot, and sometimes we fly over Western trails, Verrill told an interviewer for Art of the West. I'm familiar with history, and I'm in the air seeing it all from a distance, but in my mind and heart, I'm in a wagon going across the prairie. Physically, I'm in one century, and mentally, I'm in another. 20 miles down a dirt road stands an isolated rustic log cabin, its sole occupant busily painting and sculpting. The interview begins. In her mind, Goodnight sees images of the past, passionate hardships and triumphs, partnerships formed of adversity, people toiling with animals sharing the load. She embraces the images, gets her hands around them, and casts them in bronze, paying emotional tribute to the nameless faces of the Old West. But the interviewer cautions that scene exists only in Vera Goodnight's mind. Instead of a log cabin at the end of 20 miles of dirt road, she lives and works with husband Roger Brooks and a virtual menagerie of animals just miles from the city lights of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, a similar transmutation of times and places was evidently at work in the day the wall came down. The idea developed, says Goodnight's website, as Verrill was sculpting small studies of 5 horses during November of 1989. At the same time, vast historical changes were unfolding in Eastern Europe. On the night of November 9th, Verrill was transfixed by the television accounts of the fall of the Berlin Wall and scenes of East Berliners as they surged through the openings and into the west. That night, she had a dream that her sculpted horses, representing these people, were galloping through the rubble of the fallen Berlin Wall. Now, what right her horses had to stampede through these ruins, to represent these people, is a question that seems to have occurred neither to the artist herself nor to anybody else involved. Emotional identification was justification enough for incorporating Berlin into a script written just a few miles out of Santa Fe. I work from my heart. I have to feel it to do it, Verrill explains, catching us up in her palpable sincerity. It was in fact only a year later that she traveled to Berlin for the first time, quote, to better understand the wall in a political, emotional, and physical sense. What reason was there for her to have traveled to the city any earlier? She had long since embraced the images, gotten her hands around them, and decided how to cast them, guided by her Western dreams. Now, the day the wall came down was a striking sight, especially if you see it at sunset, silhouetted against that vast Texas sky. But there's something decidedly surreal about it, a fortuitous meeting of 2 distant realities on an inappropriate plane, to quote the surrealist painter Max Ernst, that does indeed induce what he called a systematic bewildering. Although the purported subject of the memorial is a pivotal event in the history of 20th century Central Europe, the references are all American. Wild horses are few and far between in Germany. The free-flowing lines of Goodnight's mares and stallions, trampling the ruins of communism beneath their hooves, may be intended to symbolize universal human aspirations, but they also emphatically remind us that we're in the land of Jim Bowie and David Crockett, Hoss Cartwright and Rooster Coburn, the land of the free and the home of the brave. So does the graffiti copied from the western side of the wall that Goodnight chose to incorporate in her sculpture. Much of it is in English, including the word vision, which might bring to mind George Bush's 1,000 Points of Light speech, so the 1988 Republican Convention, and the sentence, "and the people let out a loud shout and the wall fell," which is a biblical allusion that needs no explanation in Texas, where there are Christian churches on every block, and the bumper stickers proclaim it's a child, not a choice. The visual language of the monument transports the Berlin Wall to the vast open spaces of the American frontier, reinscribing it in a landscape of American dreams. There's no such thing as American history, only a frontier. Don Draper famously remarked in the TV series Mad Men, which I'm sure shows here as it does everywhere else. This remarkably insightful observation was made in the context of selling the image of American Airlines following a disastrous plane crash that the company would like everybody to forget. Draper himself might be considered the ultimate self-made man. He too has no baggage, no past to detain him, because he buried his old identity in a foxhole in Korea and minted a brand new one from the ID tag he removed from the body of a fallen lieutenant. It could be said that Draper dreamed himself into existence. The Day the Wall Came Down works in exactly the same way, only without the black humour of Mad Men. The space in which Goodnight's dream is realised is the ground zero cleared by the erasure of the Central European history, in whose place the eternal American frontier comes to stand. Quite literally, in the case of the second copy of the monument that was shipped back to Berlin, so the Germans should never forget which allies retrospectively saved their asses. As for the Disneyland storyline of that dream, Milan Kundra's definition of kitsch may be more pertinent here than Clement Greenberg's. That is to say, the need to gaze into the mirror of the beautifying lie and be moved to tears of gratification at one's own reflection. I didn't own a horse as a youngster, Vera Goodnight told an interviewer for The Trail Rider. Instead, I sculpted horses in the snow, then cried in the spring where they melted. Burrell had longed for a horse of her own ever since she was a little girl. I'm sorry about this, the PowerPoint, it's completely out of sync. Right, let's move on. As I said, I don't have any concepts for you. I wanted to focus on the story I've just told. But I would pull one or two possibly provocative suggestions out of it. The story I've told will seem, no doubt to many, a travesty of anything that might reasonably be considered historical memory. But I want to suggest that it has much to teach us about how such memory, if we can call it that, actually works. Now, I say if we can call it that advisedly. I come to this group for the first time as an outsider, and I recognize that you've been meeting for 5 years, and you've probably taught the concept of what is collective memory, if there is such a thing, to death, right? Which is why I imagine it hasn't actually been discussed. The concept has simply been used in the past 2 or 3 hours. I'm afraid my response to the concept of collective memory is very much like Susan Sontag's, who famously said, the notion of collective memory induces the same kind of feeling in me as the notion of collective punishment. I have doubts about whether there is such a thing as collective memory. If so, I want to know what is the collectivity that does the remembering, and how exactly can a collective remember, since only individuals remember. I'd like to know how we can reasonably talk of things that maybe happened beyond living memory as being memory rather than record. And that's integral. It relates to the question I asked you earlier on. I would suggest, putting it provocatively, that the field of memory studies is in fact a field which is based on very dubious analogy with individual memory. And if you push it far enough, either the analogy will break down. And at the point where the analogy does break down, we have to ask, are we actually talking about memory at all, in the sense of something that is comparable to individual memory as that term is usually used? Or are we in fact talking about something completely different than memory, but which we get an intellectual or emotional charge by using the term memory to describe it, right? Now I want to take, if only to be provocative, a fairly radical position on these issues here, which I hope will then lead to further debate. At the start of the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, Milan Kundera presents us with a famous image of the erasure of memory. In a photograph that circulated widely in communist Czechoslovakia, the fur hat on Communist Party leader Klement Gottwald's head was the only trace that remained of one-time Foreign Minister Vlado Klementis, after the censor airbrushed him out of the visual record of the communist coup d'etat of 1948. The reason they airbrushed him out of the picture was because Clementis was executed 2 years later in 1952. So Clementis had been standing next door to Gottwald. Snow started to fall. Clementis was wearing a hat. He took off his fur hat, put it on Gottwald's head to protect him from the snow. 2 years later, Clementis was executed, and they airbrushed it out, leaving just the blank wall behind. So the only trace that's left of Clementis is the hat on Gottwald's head. Now, this somewhat grotesque anecdote introduces what's perhaps the most quoted sentence that Milan Kundera ever wrote, which is, it is 1971, and Mirek says that the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Now, a character in another Czech novelist, Ivan Klima, in his book Love and Garbage, is another Czech who laments that, quote, in our country, everything is forever being remade, beliefs, buildings, and street names. Sometimes the progress of time is concealed, and at other times feigned, so long as nothing remains as real and truthful testimony. Now, Klima confronts us with the vertiginous terror of a perpetual amnesia in which there is no longer anything real to confirm the truth of the memories in which identity is anchored, only an endless parade of transparent fictions that are imposed retrospectively and updated every day. History here is palpably an artifact of the present. As with the repeatedly revised back copies of the newspapers in George Orwell's 1984, successive rewritings have put the reality of what's gone before completely beyond recovery. This produces a peculiar pathos. Klima's characters know very well that they live in a world of simulacra, but they no longer have any means of telling good copies from bad. This pathos, however, is entirely dependent upon our acceptance of the notion that behind the never-ending erasures, there exists some authentic primal identity whose truth reposes in the memory of realities that have been washed away. It's this same postulate of authenticity that makes memory a poignant locus of resistance for Kundera's character Mirek, who's defending his human integrity against the manifest fabrications of power. But Kundera is far less sentimental than his hero. In The Art of the Novel, he warns us against taking Mirek's pronouncement as the book's message. The truth, he says, is much more complicated, and the message is not the familiar Orwellian theme. The originality of Mirek's story, says Kundera, lay somewhere else entirely. This Mirek, who is struggling with all his might to make sure he is not forgotten, he and his friends and their political battle, is at the same time doing his utmost to make people forget another person, his ex-mistress, who he's ashamed of. Now, in his later book of essays, Testaments Betrayed, Kundera goes still further. Not only does he abandon Mirek's comforting equations of humanity equals remembering and power equals forgetting, he confounds the very opposition of memory and forgetting from which they draw their emotional force, generalizing Mirek's apparent personal duplicity into an existential condition. Much more than intention or pure bad faith is at issue here. In Kundera's words, and it is actually up on the screen at the point where it's meant to be, we're resigned to losing the concreteness of the present. We immediately transform the present moment into its abstraction. We need only recount an episode we experienced a few hours ago. The dialogue contracts to a brief summary, the setting to a few general features. This applies to even the strongest memories, which affect the mind deeply like a trauma. We're so dazzled by their potency that we don't realize how schematic and meager their content is. When we study, discuss, analyze a reality, we analyze it as it appears in our mind, in our memory. We know reality only in the past tense. We do not know it as it is in the present, in the moment when it's happening, when it is. The present moment is unlike the memory of it. Remembering is not the negative of forgetting. Remembering is a form of forgetting. Now, for those who are attracted to to the defiant humanism expressed in Mirek's declaration about memory, what Kundra has to say here is profoundly disturbing. It's far too easy simply to read the spectre of amnesia in modern Czech fiction, politically, as an indictment of communism's flagrant distortions of history, which on one level it very plainly is. As Zdeněk Nejedlý, who was Czechoslovakia's cultural plenipotentiary for a decade after 1948, expressed it, to us, history is not the dead past. Indeed, it is not the past at all. It is an ever-living part of the present too. I want to suggest a rather more radical position, and this brings me back to the monument with which I started. This is that the amnesia which is described by these writers is not some uniquely Czech or communist aberration, but merely makes manifest a more general truth. For when and where, we might ask, was it ever not the case that beliefs, buildings, and street names were being remade, with all the attendant vertigo the klima implies? When was the original not always already lost at the point where it became a memory? The problem, as I see it, is rather to explain how the improbable fiction of identity, of an essential authentic subjectivity that exists outside of the metamorphoses of time, could ever have been sustained at all, whether we're talking about the lives of individuals or whether we're talking about the lives of collectivities like nations. Now, it's here, I think, that memory works as magic, and quite possibly memory studies colludes in working this magic, distilling fantasy out of the ghosts of the real. We can experience ourselves as possessing identity across space and time only because our memory provides us with the means of continually recollecting ourselves in the imagined space of a past that is ever present. It's able to do this, however, precisely to the extent that memory indeed is a form of forgetting. There's far more to this than a question of selectivity, partiality, bias, or repression. The fundamental issue is the difference, and I'm using Jacques Derrida's concept here, between all memory and what it purports to be a memory of, and what this difference, this detachment of the signifier from the signified, makes possible. Memory operates entirely in the register of the symbolic, not of the real. This, I think, is very graphically illustrated, and this was why I drew attention to the detail, in the glissades of various Wests in Vera Burrell's Berlin Wall Memorial. The way in which a pivotal event in Central European history could be symbolized using an entirely Western American down-home vocabulary, and she could get away with it. Despite their sometimes astounding tactility, the power of such signifiers to catch us up and sweep us away, rather like Marcel Proust's famous Madeleine. Our memories are not the things we remember any more than history is the past. The things we remember have always already passed away. They've gone. What we call their memory is a trace, existing wholly in the realm of the signifier, which has always already gone through that transformative alchemy which Kundera describes, and which I think Vera Goodnight's sculpture admirably illustrates. It's liable to be transmuted again and again and again. Memories, in other words, stand in the same relation to the experiences that gave rise to them as images do to the real. They don't correspond to reality, they represent, which is to say, they replace it. And what enables them to do so is difference. But I think this is very nicely summed up, again, as things often are, by a novelist, Julian Barnes. In his novel England, England, his heroine observes fairly early on in the book that your first memory wasn't something like your first bra or your first friend or your first kiss or your first fuck or your first marriage or your first child or the death of your first parent or your first sudden sense of the lancing hopelessness of the human condition. It wasn't like any of that. It wasn't a solid, seizable thing, which time, in its plodding, humorous way, might decorate down the years with fanciful details, a gauzy swirl of mist, a thundercloud, a coronet, but could never expunge. A memory, by definition, was not a thing. It was a memory. A memory now of a memory a bit earlier, of a memory before that, of a memory way back when. I don't think I can do better than that. Thank you. Yeah.
Better, okay. Can I just ask you for one additional comment? You have a few pictures of Potsdamer Platz there in your slides. You didn't actually talk about them. Could you perhaps you could elaborate on how this relates to your ideas?
I had never been there until about 3 days ago when I took a lot of photographs. And I learned from guidebooks and plaques on buildings and things of this kind that the whole area had essentially been erased physically during World War II, leaving very, very little standing, right? And then following the division of Berlin, the building of the wall and so on, it was essentially a wasteland for 40 years. Then the wall came down and the place was redeveloped, and it is now a very vibrant commercial, cultural centre. We stayed in the Sony Centre, rented an apartment there, which is extremely glitzy postmodern architecture. Many of the buildings in the neighbourhood are by what these days they call starchitects. Renzo Piano is one. But they had, which was quite an achievement given that the place had been totally erased, they nonetheless made gestures to try and remind you of the fact that the Potsdamer Platz was a metropolitan centre in Berlin in the interwar period, commercial hub of the city and all the rest of it. And this affected, they tried to replicate exactly where the traffic circle was and things of this kind. And of course, they left bits and pieces which I photographed there, including a sign of Potsdamer Platz, which is actually embedded in the concrete and glass of one of these huge glitzy buildings behind glass, okay, as some sort of a reminder. Now, there's actually not enough there physically to remind you what it really looked like, could ever have looked like, and some of it's really bizarre because what's actually facing the streets and behind glass and immaculately preserved was in fact interior. So you've got a fireplace, the mantelpiece, and wallpaper facing out on the street, right? And I'm not sure that this struck me as an exact metaphor for anything so much as something else about which one might very well ponder, about the relationship between not the past and the present per se, but the signifiers of the past and what they do in the present, right? And particularly where you can attach some materiality, and therefore trace of genuineness to the signifier. So I guess, you know, I was looking around for some illustrations for these last 3 or 4 slides, and this struck me as ideal. I mean, this, you know, this is an example. It's a little bit of a facade that clearly had actually survived. Yeah, this was the street sign. Very ghostly.
Yeah, there's an interesting metaphor perhaps about the glass, which makes it unattainable to the viewer. But anyway, enough for me. To be
There we go. Thank you for that very provocative talk. I'm going to offer a what sounds like a perhaps more hostile than appropriate reaction and ask for your reaction to it. That was not accidental. Okay. Okay, yes, thanks. Is there not a contradiction between your rejection of the value of a concept of collective memory or a collectivist understanding of memory and the strong emphasis you place on the symbolic in memory? That is, if you limit memory to an individual level process, in fact, we are dealing with a profoundly important material substratum, namely the brain and neurological processes that are involved. So that, for instance, I read just in the newspaper just yesterday of an experiment where they were able to induce memories by electrical stimulation of the brain, memories that had been lost in Alzheimer's patients and the like. Right. Additionally, for instance, there's pretty good evidence of a physiological basis when we talk about traumatic memory or traumatic experiences. The traumatic events, traumatic experiences are chemically coded in a different way, neurologically structured in a different way than remembering your phone number or remembering what you had for lunch yesterday. So that there seems to be a contradiction between the denial of the value of collective memory and the exclusivity you place on memory as symbolic. Now, since I don't have any problem with the concept of collective memory, I don't face the same challenge, but even so, I would recall in this context the challenges that Maurice Halbwachs faced when he published his Social Frameworks of Memory in 1925 from the psychiatrist Charles Blondel, who argued that Halbwachs was neglecting the somatic bases of memory.
I'm not sure that there is a contradiction. Let me try and be more precise about what I find disturbing around the concept of collective memory, right? It's certainly not the symbolic content. Indeed, I would argue that most of what we consider to be individual memory is collective in its content, because it is carried on by language and other signifiers, and those are inherently collective, right? So at that level, I don't have a problem with a collective or sociological description of memory. What I have a problem with is the attribution of collective subjectivity that can go with it if you're not very careful, whereby you go from saying that, you know, there is clearly a large, possibly overwhelmingly collective component to all memory, to saying that there is a collective that remembers, right? As distinct from there are individuals who remember, and parts of what they remember, maybe most of what they remember, is shared in various ways with others, right? I think where that's particularly problematic and has been extremely problematic politically is when the collective in question is the nation. And then one talks about national memory, right? And against that, I would want to argue, sure, there are stocks of shared signifiers which bind particular communities, even though they may well be contested and interpreted in multiple ways within those communities, and they may also exceed those communities in the way that, say, in the example I gave. Clearly, Vera Burrell's Berlin is not the Berliners' Berlin, right? But there are nonetheless points of contact. Right? So I don't want to challenge the collectivity of that stock of signifiers, if you like, the total contrary. What I do want to challenge is that there is some subject that is actually doing the remembering that is analogous to the individual, right? Because there, I think that you have a classic problem of misplaced concreteness, of reification, that you yourself actually identified when you talked this morning as being a potential problem with the concept of region. Once you start talking about regional memory, there is a danger that you give a false concreteness to the remembered region. East Central Europe being a very good one in question, actually, because were you looking, say, take my own work is largely on Prague, right? What anybody in Prague might have identified as their sort of region of reference in 1820 would have been very, very different than if the same thing had been done in 1900, right? Precisely because it's not geographic. It is social and linguistic. Anyway, I'm drifting, I'm rambling.
So, even if I try to read you the signification and real in a very Lacanian way, basically even for him also the real had certain surplus. And if I want to take the real in a realism way, even any real event or even so-called real memory, if I just take it as an object, it has certain surplus, and that surplus meets certain features of the individuals, and they remember their own ways. So that's what I actually agree with the fact that I have an issue with the idea of collective memory also. But then at the end of a story, there is something called memory somewhere. Yes, we don't have access to that particular real, but in between somehow we form a third object or third form of reality between our reality and that reality and mediate to it. So there is somewhere something somewhere which we don't access it. And that's called so-called the capital real.
No, I'm not denying the existence of the real. I wouldn't have used the concept if I did. What I argue is simply that, and it's a straightforward Lacanian position, that the signifier takes the place of, stands in for, does not correspond to, right? Yes. The real.
Yes,
and I would simply want to extend that insight to ways in which we talk about memory.
Thank you very much for this very, very intriguing case of the horses in Texas, right? But I want to ask a question about that. But before that, just as a comment, I mean, I don't think anybody here would posit the idea of collective memory in the sense of as being a sort of a mega, sort of individual memory written large. I think that if we're looking back at the development of memory studies over the last decades, it's been precisely about the notion that there are different points of hinges connection from which goes from individual to larger aggregates, but that this is a very complex process, and that there's no way in which there's a sort of big heart beating out there, which is called our big brain, which is a collective memory. I don't think that's the way we've been thinking.
Can I briefly respond to that?
Yeah.
I don't see myself as being in memory studies, and I'm not familiar with a lot of the literature that's referred to this morning, right? But I don't for a moment imagine that you have this very crude concept, right, of a collective memory. But I would want to throw back at you the question, what does using the term memory do for you that you couldn't do by talking about discourse or whatever, right? Because it seems to me there's a sense in which you're wanting to have your cake and eat it. Okay. On the one hand, you want to deconstruct the notion of memory as ordinarily understood. On the other hand, you don't want to dissolve it entirely to the point where it just becomes another form of or kind of discourse which is distinguished by reference to the past. And I would also suggest an identification with that on the part of those that are remembered or whatever. Yeah.
No, that's a valid challenge back. But as if thinking on this notion of the collectives as something which is also constructed through all of these types of exchanges, and you might think of distributed memory rather than collective memory might be a way of looking at it as well, and the notion that it's a complex process of, as I was suggesting, it's more of exchanges of stories which are linked to identity. And so this maybe brings me to my question, and which hopefully will help also to elucidate this issue. In thinking about that case you have, which is on the one hand about an American commemoration, I think that's the word that you have to use here, commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall and of the role of the Americans in that event. At the same time, as you showed us very well, that it's also the language in which is being used is a language which recalls the language of the sort of the Don Draper, the frontier idea, and particularly then this idea of liberation with this, perhaps a subtext of women's sort of gender notion of it. So in other words, that this commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall is also triggering, certainly in your analysis, a whole sort of reservoir of earlier stories which have to do with American identity. Now, why might that be useful to call that memory? I would call it cultural memory because it's a reservoir of stories which are linked to identity. And why call it memory rather than discourse? A very good question. I think it has to do with this question of that it's over time you're looking at. You're looking at the persistence of certain patterns in, of course, time, which is linked to a sense of identity, which is linked to time as well. So it's, if you like, it's a variation on these of discourse, but it allows you to ask different sorts of questions about this question of transmission over generations. So maybe my question back to you would be if you could reflect a bit more on the fact that this sort of pioneer discourse memory of all of these earlier stories was being used to talk about the Berlin Wall, and what that might say on this discussion of the memory.
My response to that, as so often, is a yes and no response. I certainly think you're absolutely right that that act of commemoration is also about American memory, if you like, right? And it's extraordinarily productive because it's sewing things together in exactly the way that you were talking about, right? I also agree that we're talking about, I'm not sure what the right verb to use is, but I'll use the verb transmission, if you like, through time, okay? But that's also something I think needs to be unpacked, because I don't think it's persistence of patterns. I think it's something that is worked and reworked, and you have to tell the story of that, right? And I mean, I face this particular problem when dealing with Czech history, because from one point of view, there shouldn't even be a Czech history, because I mean, most of Czech history has been a matter of being occupied by somebody else, right? First problem anybody dealing with that country, historian, is what am I writing history of, right? And the answer I came to in the end is that what gives the national history its coherence is, again, to use the terms I was using earlier, it is actually the recurrence of signifiers. The signifiers themselves may shift, but they nonetheless recur, and it's that recurrence that gives coherence. I'll give an example. The year 1415, the religious reformer Jan Hus was burnt at the stake at Konstanz. That unleashed decades of war in Bohemia, where the Czechs, as they retrospectively put it anyway, proudly held off the forces of Catholic Europe, right? Now, the burning of Jan Hus and the subsequent Hussite wars have come up again and again and again in subsequent Czech history as what Lacan would call a point de capital, something that actually buttons down that history, even though during the Baroque, when the country was re-Catholicized, Jan Hus was a heretic, arch-heretic, right? During the National Revival in the 19th century, he was lionized as a national hero, as a Czech hero, as defender of the Czech language. In the early 20th century, with people like Tomáš Masaryk, the country's first president, he was lauded as a humanist, right, pushing for progressive values. Then in the 1950s, he became a class warrior, right, for the communists. Now, you know, what was signified in each case differed, but there was a structure of repetition that was created, right? Now, I think there's far more involved there than persistence. Yeah? I'm sure you don't disagree. Yeah, yeah.
My question is follow up Anne's question. I mean, can you return to the poem by the sculptor? This is her poem, Hobby Pet the Bison. It's a typical 19th century frontier.
Which poem?
A poem about the West, right? Some woman with the skirt, something like that. No, before that. No, all those poems, I think that they have a certain connotation of the making frontier, right? Yeah. And I mean that, in a sense, it reminds me of the Cold War discourse about the communism and the capitalism. I mean that Western is quite a civilized country, so in the name of civilization, we need to, liberate these people from the communist barbarism and so on. So in this sense, I'm not sure if we can call it collective memory or not, but certainly we can find a certain frame in which these Americans commemorate fall of the communism, fall of the Berlin Wall. So her hobby of raising the bison and Zubrówka, this is really certain frame.
No, when I've given this talk or something similar to this before, right? I have on occasion been attacked for deriding Americans and deriding the sculptor. I am actually doing no such thing. I think you're completely right. You know, they are sewing together various discourses of liberation, quite clearly. And it makes a perfectly internally coherent sense, right? So I'm not simply trying to argue that Americans have got the history of Berlin wrong. The exact opposite. I would argue that there are many, many ways of remembering the history of Berlin which are in principle equally legitimate, right, including this one. But if you focus on this one, it's going to raise all sorts of interesting questions about how memory, transmission, and so on does actually work. I would say in particular the way the heartstrings are being plucked, the way the familiar is being mobilized and linked to events happening a long way away, are very important elements in it.
Wait for the
Sorry?
microphone, please.
You disagree?
I would disagree with you on that point, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. I think that the monument is not about the Berlin Wall. It's about Texas. And specifically, it's about George Bush. And it's about his it's a self-congratulatory monument. It appears to me when you read the plaque, there's a whole agenda behind that we could spend a lot of time unpacking. And we could think about what was going on in the US, what was happening during his presidency that was very controversial, and why he might have a vested interest in doing some PR work, presenting himself as a paragon of a peacemaker. So I'll stop my comments there. I enjoyed your presentation. I thought that the monument was a very good case study. Actually, I won't stop my comments. I'll add one more thing. We could analyze this on so many levels because the horse, in fact, which is, we can trace that back to the Wild West and see that as a symbol of the Wild West. But horses are not originally native to North America. They were brought by European colonialists, so there's that whole history there. And then when the Spaniards traded with Native Americans, that's how they got those horses, et cetera. So, I mean, we really do see this layering effect.
Yes.
There's a whole archaeological work that could be done to unpack this. And I think in some ways that's what makes monuments so rich. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's obviously a bit of Texas self-congratulation. But I don't think that the two readings are mutually exclusive. I mean, I think it's also doing work and telling a story. And it's quite interesting how it does that, right? On the level of motive, I'm sure you're right. And I would like to, I mean, if I could be bothered to research it, or indeed if I were able to research it, I would like to know more about the links between Vera Goodnight and the Bush family. Because I know that a lot of her stuff is in rich Texas ranchers' houses and so on, it's in corporate headquarters. I mean, it was not an accidental choice. That was clearly an interesting one.
Any more questions or comments?
Why did you put the photo of 1936 Paris Expo? You didn't explain.
No, I didn't, did I? I was talking about the quote from Kundera. Talks about how we remember what is most traumatic and we remember it schematically. And that to me is, if I were to think of a single schematic representation of the 1930s, it would be that, right? It's the two things staring each other down, right? The third thing that you don't see in the picture was in the same exhibition was Picasso's Guernica. So that's why it's there.
If there are no more questions, last chance, then please join me in thanking Derek for a very fascinating and thought-provoking talk.